Why are drugs like cannabis prohibited at all? I think mainly there's a historical explanation to that question. You can argue that cannabis is illegal because it's harmful, but of course drugs like alcohol and tobacco are harmful as well, and they're legal. So cannabis is prohibited because, you know, it reached the modern world slightly later than alcohol and tobacco. It was seen as an evil thing used by Mexican people in the south of the US, and people didn't like that, and I think it seems as if people were trying to, you know, segregate and punish foreigners, and cannabis was a way to do that within the US. And then of course the UN made those things illegal in the 50s and 60s. I can't remember exactly when, with the scheduling of drugs. So yeah, cannabis is prohibited because the UN made it illegal, and that's a historical fact.
Do you think is decriminalization of drugs needed? Would you support this legislative law?
So personally, I think that I would support changes to drug laws. I wouldn't make them quickly, I wouldn't make them drastically. I wouldn't go from what we have now to regulation and legalisation of all drugs, but I do think what we have now definitely isn't working. Drugs are clearly very available, and the harms of that policy are many. Loads of people being, you know, having things on their criminal records, people not being safe, the whole global crime networks being related to drugs mostly. So clearly what we have now doesn't work, and decriminalisation is the first step towards improving our drug policy. So yes, I would definitely support it, and at first that would probably involve decriminalisation of cannabis.
And how would it affect the whole drug market? What would happen with black market?
Well, decriminalisation wouldn't take away the black market, of course, because that's just saying that possession of a small amount, of a personal amount, isn't illegal. And so you'd still have a black market, you'd still have dealers who are selling you drugs, not in a legal fashion. So obviously that wouldn't help with the kind of black market problem, but it would help in terms of not kind of persecuting drug users, and also it would help with probably help with people seeking help if they need it, like it has done in Portugal. So, and in terms of, I mean, I think I'm no expert in drug policy changes, but the evidence from Portugal suggests that, you know, the markets don't hugely increase if you decriminalise drugs. It's not like your whole country is awash with drug dealers, so that would be very unlikely to happen.
Do you think it will increase the number of people who use drugs?
Well, so again, I think the best thing to do is to look to other countries, and Portugal, I know that this is controversial. Some people claim that things have gone up and some people claim that things have gone down, but my relatively unexpert view is that, you know, when you look at the evidence, absolutely Portugal has not had huge surges in drug use, and I think in vulnerable groups such as adolescents, then, you know, you've actually seen reductions in groups like that. So no, I wouldn't expect massive increases in drug use with decriminalisation. And then with legalisation, if drugs were sold through shops, I think you need to look at, you know, research done in the States of America and Uruguay, and I'm not entirely sure, but the idea I've got is that it hasn't completely gone out of control. One way that you might quantify how addictive a drug is is the proportion of people who try it that go on to become addicted to it. And the drug that we have in the world, which is most addictive by that metric, is tobacco. So about 35% of people who try tobacco go on to become addicted to it. Now that number is 9% for cannabis. So many fewer people who try cannabis go on to become addicted to cannabis. And it's about 18% for cocaine and 23% for heroin and 15% for alcohol. So they all sit kind of in this between 10 and 25% region, with nicotine as an outlier as the most addictive. Now, the important thing to note is that clearly the pharmacology of each drug plays a role. So no one ever gets, becoming addicted to a, let's say, like an antihistamine would be extremely unlikely. But some drugs are kind of pleasurable, and they might kind of make changes to our brains which make us lead to addictive behaviour in the future. That's what a kind of neuroscientist's view of addiction is that you take drugs, your brain changes, and now you're addicted. But of course society plays a big role as well, and because alcohol and tobacco are so accepted, I think that's one of the reasons why addiction can progress more easily with those drugs. And also, so this is one argument in favour of prohibition, not that I would argue in favour of prohibition, but it appears that drugs which are illegal, there are kind of societal and social norm factors fighting against the development of addiction, and also it's easier to recover from illegal drugs, probably because society looks down upon the users of those drugs. And not that that's a good thing, but that is probably a thing that actually happens. So in answer to your question, yes, there clearly are drugs which are less addictive. You know, like if you go into Boots, all of the most of those things behind the cabinet will be drugs that aren't addictive. And then drugs like LSD and magic mushrooms have very, very low addictive potential. So obviously some people do end up with problems, but a very small number of people. And then there are drugs like alcohol, cocaine, heroin and tobacco, which are, you know, the most addictive drugs that we know of. But it's still really important to note that the vast majority of people who try those drugs don't go on to become addicted, you know, around 80% of them. Some interesting work with psilocybin showing that psilocybin increases a personality trait called openness from the Big Five personality inventory. And people thought that personality was a more stable concept, that it wasn't really changed much over a lifetime or affected by events, but some really interesting research has shown that by giving people psilocybin you do see increases in this openness to experience. So, you know, I'll go on that roller coaster, or I'm open-minded to another person's viewpoint. And I think that's really cool. Obviously that's like a positive thing to have in someone, I think, openness. And that relates to spirituality. And those same people that have done that, like Roland Griffiths and Matthew Johnson, have shown that these occasions with psilocybin often are ascribed, you know, one of the 5 most important experiences in someone's life, which is amazing. You know, they've just given someone a drug and generally they mostly have a good time, and people look back on it and think, you know, that was nearly as important as seeing my child be born. Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with the fact that these drugs do have the potential to have spiritual meaningfulness for people, and potentially that be a kind of beneficial thing. I'm not particularly kind of spiritual or religious person, but I can totally see why those drugs kind of can elicit, you know, mystical experiences.
Is there any future for the psychedelics in either medical research or social applications?
Definitely medical applications over the next 20, 30 years, you're going to see, I really think there'll be huge innovations and acceptance of drugs, especially psilocybin, being accepted as treatments for depression and substance use. Yeah, that's that. I'm 99% sure that will happen. It just takes a while, I think, because the funding bodies maybe aren't so keen on funding it, but the MRC have funded Robin Carhart Harris's research and David Nutt's research, and they funded the ketamine research that I was involved with, treating alcoholism with ketamine, which is still ongoing. And so, yeah, and then obviously it will take time for those practices to be accepted by society, but I do think that there's a big future in psychedelic drugs being used to help with psychological disorders.